The snow had frozen into a hard, glittering crust that crunched under boots and tracks. Somewhere in the dark woods beyond the road, an artillery battery thudded a slow, distant rhythm, muffled by pine and snow. The crossroads itself was little more than a widening of the blacktop, a place where one narrow road from the east met another running north and south along the ridge line the Americans called Skyline Drive. Four Shermans waited there, engines idling low, exhaust creeping white across the frozen ditch. Their steel hulls were washed in white paint and slapped with branches for camouflage, but under the frost they were still unmistakably American machines, squat and purposeful against the winter forest. Lieutenant Colonel Richard W. Ripple pulled his scarf tighter as he climbed down from the jeep. His breath hung in the air while he walked toward the nearest tank, where a young officer stood silhouetted on the turret, headset around his neck. The man snapped to attention, gloved hand rising to his helmet. "3rd Platoon, a company, reporting, sir," he said. "Lieutenant Payne." Ripple nodded, more brisk than formal. "At ease, Lieutenant. We do not have time for ceremony." Robert Payne rested his hand on the rim of the turret and tried to look like he understood everything that was happening. He was 23 years old, and the tanks behind him represented most of what was left of his platoon. The 5th Sherman was still limping up the road with a thrown track, somewhere back in the trees. Ripple gestured toward the east, where the road fell away into a dark valley and then climbed again toward the unseen village of Hosingen. Beyond that, somewhere in the darkness and fog, lay the Our River and the German border. "Orders from division," he said, voice low so it would not carry too far. "The Krauts are over the river in force. 2 divisions at least, probably more. Strong points in front of you are getting pounded. If they break through here, Lieutenant, there is nothing behind you until Bastogne." He let that sink in. The only sounds were the soft clatter of engines and the occasional clink of metal as a crewman shifted inside a tank. "Nothing behind us, sir," Payne repeated. "Artillery columns, fuel dumps, headquarters, road junctions filled with traffic," Ripple said. "But no prepared line, no dug-in infantry. If they come up this road in strength and get past you, they will roll into the open rear of 8 Corps and they will have a straight shot toward Bastogne and the Meuse. Division says to hold this line. Corps says to hold this line." He met Payne's eyes. "You understand what that means?" Payne swallowed. His hand tightened on the turret ring until the glove creaked. "Hold," he said. "Or die." Ripple did not contradict him. "You are not alone," he said instead. "You have Company K of the 110th Infantry dug in down there in the village. They will anchor your right. Artillery is still behind us, for now. We will try to get you fuel and ammo as long as the roads are open. But the Germans want this road. They will come for it. Your job is to make them pay for every yard." He stepped closer, dropped his voice another notch. "You tell your men this, Lieutenant. There are thousands of them. There are a few hundred of us. We are here to buy time. Hours, maybe a day. Those hours are going to matter in ways they cannot see and you cannot see, but I promise you they will matter. You hold this crossroads, and you change what happens next." Behind Payne, in the steel belly of the nearest Sherman, Corporal Sam Rosen sat hunched over the breech of the 75mm gun, listening to fragments of the conversation through the open turret hatch. His fingers were numb inside his gloves, but the gun was warm under his palm. He had loaded it himself, round by round, he and AP and white phosphorus, counting each shell like a miser. Hold or die, he thought. Easy for generals to say on a map. Hard when you were the man behind the gun. Somewhere beyond the tree line to the east, a German flare went up, greenish-white against the low clouds. A moment later, another answered it farther down the valley. The Ardennes, the quiet front, was waking up. Only a few weeks earlier, this had been the place where divisions came to rest. The Ardennes forest straddled the borders of Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany, a rolling plateau of ridges and valleys carved by small rivers and covered in deep, dark woods. Before the war, it had been a place of hunting lodges and summer holidays. In the winter of 1944, to the American High Command, it was supposed to be something else, a backwater, a quiet sector where battered units could recover from the meat grinder of places like the Hurtgen Forest and the Siegfried Line. The terrain was rough, the roads few and narrow. It did not seem like the sort of place where anyone would launch a major offensive. They called it the Ghost Front, because for months almost nothing had happened there. A few patrols, an occasional artillery harassing fire, the distant crack of a sniper's rifle. The German units opposite seemed as exhausted as the Americans, more interested in keeping their heads down than in stirring up trouble. Intelligence reports said the enemy was on the defensive everywhere, too weak and too low on fuel to try anything large. The war, it seemed, was tightening its grip around Germany. Surely, many thought, the worst was over. For the men of the 28th Infantry Division and the tankers of the 707th Tank Battalion, the Ardennes was a cold, muddy respite. They had paid in blood for a few weeks of relative quiet. The 28th Division, Pennsylvania National Guard, had fought through Normandy, bled itself in the hedgerows and villages of France, and then been hurled against the German defenses in the Hurtgen Forest, that maze of fir trees and ravines where artillery blasts turned trees into spears. In November, its regiments had tried to seize the village of Schmidt in the Col Valley and had been thrown back with heavy losses. Its infantry battalions were reduced, its officers weary. The division commander, Major General Norman Cota, had asked for relief. He got it in late November, when the division was pulled out of the line and sent south into Luxembourg to occupy a quiet stretch along the Aar River. It would hold the line, yes, but this was meant to be a place to rebuild, to absorb replacements, to re-knit shattered units. With the 28th Division came its attached tank battalion, the 707th. The battalion had been activated the previous year and had fought its first battles in the fall of 1944, supporting the 28th in the Hurtgen. In those woods its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Richard W. Ripple, had already earned a reputation for stubbornness. Forming Task Force Ripple, he had tried to punch through to Schmidt with a mix of infantry and tanks along narrow forest tracks, only to see his tanks immobilized by mud, mines, and German fire. Company A had been chewed up there, its tanks lost among the trees and villages that would even now make veterans shudder when they heard the name Schmidt. The battalion withdrew to Luxembourg with battered crews and a lot of empty slots on its roster. Luxembourg had seemed like another world. Instead of shell craters and blackened stumps, the men found steep, wooded hills dotted with tidy stone farmhouses and small towns clustered around churches. The Aar River curled at the foot of the hills, narrow and cold, marking the boundary between Allied territory and Germany. Roads ran along the ridge above the river and then dropped down into deep valleys, climbing again on the far side in a series of switchbacks. The most important of those roads was the one the Americans called Skyline Drive, a two-lane strip of blacktop that wound along the ridge from the Belgian town of St. Vith in the north to the Luxembourgish town of Dijkerk in the south. Along this ridge Cota spread his division thin. The 109th, 110th, and 112th Infantry regiments each held a long sector. Their rifle companies dug into small strongpoints around villages such as Marnach, Hosingen, Holstham, and Konsthum. Battalion outposts sat in platoon-size pockets, often separated by forests and draws where neither side patrolled much. To stiffen these outposts, the division kept its most mobile asset in reserve, the 707th Tank Battalion. In early December, the headquarters of the 707th settled into the village of Wiltz, a cluster of stone houses along the Clervaux River, a tributary of the Our. Ripple's companies were pushed out behind the infantry, ready to move on short notice. Company A and Company B, equipped with M4 Shermans, had their platoons billeted near Clervaux and along Skyline Drive behind the 110th Infantry. Company C was tied to the 109th Infantry farther south near Dijkerk, and Company D, with its lighter M5 Stuart tanks, found itself supporting the 112th. The men slept in barns and schoolhouses, drew hot coffee from field kitchens, and tried to pretend it was almost peacetime. On a typical day, a platoon might send one tank out on a short patrol along the Our, rolling along muddy farm tracks while infantrymen walked alongside. They would peer across the river at the dark German shore, see no movement, and return to billets as the early winter twilight closed in. The rest of the day was maintenance and training. Frost turned the morning mud to ruts of iron. The Sherman's Continental engines were reliable, but only if they could be coaxed into life in the freezing cold. Mechanics cursed as they wrestled with frozen oil, swapped spark plugs, and patched leaks in tired radiators. Crews sloshed hot water over hydraulic lines, then dried everything quickly before it refroze. Staff Sergeant Mike Herrera spent more time under tanks than in them. As one of the battalion's senior maintenance NCOs, he knew the chug and rattle of each Sherman like a doctor knew a patient's heartbeat. Herrera had come from Texas, where winter meant a light jacket and maybe a frost on the windshield. In the Ardennes, he wrapped his hands in rags under his gloves so his fingers would not weld themselves to cold steel. "Listen to that," he muttered one afternoon as a tank tried to turn over and only coughed slowly. "She is telling you she is tired. She needs warmth, not you beating the starter to death." The driver, a kid from Ohio, grinned down at him from the hatch. "You coming in this thing with us when it goes, Sarge?" Herrera spat into the snow, where it froze almost immediately. "No thanks. I like my feet on the ground. You can sweat inside that iron stove. I will be right here, cleaning up after you." Payne's platoon, like others, had found a kind of uneasy rhythm. They trained gunnery on makeshift ranges, fired a few rounds at abandoned stone walls to keep the crews sharp, then went back to billets. Rosen, the gunner, sometimes sat on the tank's glassy plate in the thin winter sun, cigarette cupped in his hand, and tried not to think about Schmidt or Krinkelt or any of the other names that had already filled his short war. At night, in farmhouses where Luxembourgers had reluctantly moved into basements or into back rooms, the tankers played cards and listened to the BBC on small radios, catching bits of news about Allied advances in the Netherlands and in the Ruhr Valley. The big picture sounded good. The German army, they were told, was beaten, only holding on in the west while the Russians crushed it from the east. There were rumors of an offensive somewhere in Alsace, speculation about the next big Allied push. But nothing suggested that this quiet plateau, this ghost front, would become the center of a storm. The German High Command saw it differently. For Adolf Hitler, December 1944 was the moment for one last gamble. He believed that if he could split the Anglo-American alliance and seize the port of Antwerp, he might still force a negotiated peace in the West. To do that, he planned an offensive straight through the Ardennes to the Meuse River and beyond. The plan was ambitious to the point of fantasy, but it had two advantages. First, the Allies did not expect it. Second, the terrain that made offensive operations difficult also meant the front was thinly held. On the German side of the Our, in the dark forests and villages along the Eifel, entire divisions had been moved into position in secrecy. The 5th Panzer Army under General Otto von Manschufel crouched opposite the 28th Division, its spearhead units from the 2nd Panzer Division and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division hidden in the woods. Panzers were dogged by fuel shortages, and many of the divisions were under strength, but against companies and platoons scattered along a long front, they would have overwhelming superiority. For days before the offensive, German patrols had probed the river crossings, slipping across at night to cut telephone lines and mark American positions. The weather cooperated. Snow, freezing rain, and low clouds grounded Allied aircraft and muffled the movements of trucks and tanks. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, as most of the 707th's tankers slept in barns and farmhouses, German artillery batteries all along the front began to move their guns into firing positions. Command posts flickered to life under camouflage netting, maps spread out on tables. At 5:30 in the morning, in the pre-dawn darkness, the quiet front exploded. The opening barrage rolled across the American lines like a thunderstorm. Heavy guns and rocket launchers pounded strongpoints, crossroads, and communication centers. In places like Marnach and Hosingen, small infantry garrisons crouched in cellars while houses above them disintegrated into splinters and dust. Field telephones went dead as wires were cut by shell fragments. Radio operators in the 110th Infantry's battalions tried to make sense of overlapping reports, enemy shells, enemy patrols, movement on the far bank of the Our. It was hard to know where the main effort lay. Everywhere seemed to be under attack. In Wiltz, Ripple was jolted awake by the sound of artillery and the clatter of boots in the hallway. Somebody pounded on his door. "Colonel, sir. Message from division. The Krauts are coming." He dressed in the dim light of a single bulb, pulling on his boots while the house shook around him. The field kitchen had coffee ready by the time he reached the makeshift battalion command post. Officers crowded around the map table, tracing the blue penciled line of the front and the red grease pencil marks that indicated enemy reports. The phone from division crackled to life. Maj Gen Koda's orders were simple in their outline, complicated in their implications. The 28th Division was to hold. The thin line along the Our had to buy time for higher headquarters to understand the size of the attack and move reserves. In the middle sector, where the 110th Infantry Regiment faced the brunt of the assault, that meant bringing the tanks into play. The 707th, which had been in reserve, was put into motion almost immediately. Company A and Company B were assigned to reinforce the 110th Infantry strongpoints along Skyline Drive and in the villages of Marnach, Hosingen, and Holstham. Company C was to support the 109th Infantry in the south. Company D, the Light Tank Company, would move toward Heinerscheid and support the 112th Infantry. For a battalion that had expected another day of minor patrols and engine work, the change was abrupt and sobering. Herrera was already at work when the first orderlies arrived at the motor pool, breathless with the news. Tanks that had been partially torn down for maintenance had to be slapped back together in minutes. Engines that would not start had to be coaxed into life by any means necessary. Men ran between vehicles with jerry cans of gasoline and cans of antifreeze. Drivers stamped their feet and cursed the cold while they waited for green lights on the dashboard. Payne's 3rd platoon received its orders through Company A's commander. They were to move from their positions near Clervaux up onto Skyline Drive and prepare to counterattack south toward Hosingen. The infantry company there was under attack and needed armor support. If Hosingen fell quickly, German troops would spill onto the Ridge Road and roll up the 110th Battalion's positions from the rear. As Payne swung into his commander's seat and cinched his headset over his helmet, Rosen slid into his position behind the gun and patted the breech. "Guess the vacation is over," he said. "It was never a vacation," the loader muttered, slamming a rack of 75mm shells into place. "Just an intermission." The column crawled out of the village street one tank at a time, climbing toward the ridge. Snow fell in light, swirling flakes that clung to the front of the tanks. The road was narrow, with steep slopes on either side. Thick pine woods crowded close to the shoulders. There was nowhere to disperse, nowhere to maneuver off the hard surface. "Keep it steady," Payne told his driver. "Do not bunch up. Give us room to back up if we have to." "Copy that, Lieutenant," came the reply through the intercom, muffled by the engine's rumble. As they crossed into the zone held by the 110th Infantry, they passed clumps of riflemen moving in the opposite direction, hunched under the weight of their packs, faces pale under helmet rims. Some waved. Others stared in silence at the tanks. A few Luxembourger civilians huddled along the roadside, pushing handcarts piled with bedding and small children, eyes wide as they stared at the armored column. In Company D's sector, farther north, the light tanks had already learned how dangerous this road could be. Shortly after dawn, the Stuart tanks had rolled along the same stretch of Skyline Drive, their thin armor and light guns hardly more than a gesture against the German assault guns waiting ahead. As they emerged from the village of Heinerscheid and began to climb, German high-velocity guns, likely Sturmgeschütz 3 assault guns carefully sighted in the trees, opened up. One by one, the Stuarts were hit as if in a shooting gallery, small explosions flashing against the white snow as the little tanks brewed up. For Company D, the first day of the offensive was also almost the last. Payne's Shermans were heavier, their armor thicker, but on that narrow road they were no less vulnerable to a well-placed ambush. Every bend in the road, every patch of woods, looked like a place where a German gun could be hiding. The growing light did little to ease the unease. Fog and blowing snow reduced visibility to a few hundred yards. The first shot came without warning. Rosen heard it more than saw it, a sharp, flat crack that cut through the engine noise and the rattle of treads. A moment later, the tank ahead of Payne's erupted in orange flame, a jet of fire licking out of the turret ring. Its tracks ground to a halt, and the turret sagged as if the machine itself had been punched in the gut. "Hit," someone shouted over the radio. "Number 2 is hit." "Back up, back up," Payne yelled. "Reverse, now." The driver jammed the gear. The Sherman lurched backward, its tracks slipping on the icy surface. Behind them, another tank was trying to do the same thing, but the road was more sloped than level, and vehicles slewed dangerously close together. Somewhere off to the right, in the trees, another gun fired. The round screamed past, so close it shook the tank with its passage. Rosen slammed his forehead against the sight, searching for a target. Through the murk and the trees he caught a glimpse of something low and angular, a gun barrel protruding from a squat casemate, muzzle flashing as it fired. "Stoogie, 2 o'clock, in the trees," he shouted. "Range 400. Payne's voice was tight on the intercom. "On the way, Sam. Put one into him." Rosen traversed, the turret whining as it swung. He thumbed the trigger. The gun recoiled, filling the turret with smoke and the smell of burnt cordite. The loader slammed another round into the breech, his movements automatic, practiced 100 times on ranges and in other, warmer battles. The round detonated near the German gun, showering snow and splinters over its position. Whether it knocked it out or only stunned the crew, Rosen did not know. The important thing was that they had a moment to move. "Keep backing up," Payne ordered. "Use the burning tank as cover. We are not charging into that." It took long minutes to disentangle the column, to get the surviving Shermans off the stretch of road dominated by the unseen guns. When they finally found cover behind a fold in the ground, Payne reported by radio what they had run into. The answer was not comforting. The enemy was across the hour in strength, in multiple places. There were reports of German infantry in American uniforms leading troopers astray, reports of tanks north and south. There would be no easy way forward, but the orders remained the same. Hosingen must be reached. The line must hold. The first day of the attack settled into a brutal pattern along Skyline Drive and the Aar Valley. German infantry from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division filtered through the woods and attacked American outposts from unexpected directions, bypassing some positions to encircle others. Strong points like Hosingen and Marnach fought as islands, surrounded by enemy troops but still holding their ground. Artillery duels rumbled overhead, shells ripping into forests and fields. Radio messages were intermittent, often confused, punctuated by bursts of static. At Hosingen, Company K, 110th Infantry, clung to the village as German artillery set houses on fire and infantry probed closer and closer to the perimeter. The men there asked repeatedly for more ammunition, more support. When Payne's tanks finally reached them, late in the afternoon, the arrival of the Shermans brought a surge of relief. The tanks came down the road from the north, machine guns chattering as they fired into hedgerows and tree lines. Payne's lead tank rumbled into the village with its .50 caliber hammering at windows where German riflemen might be hiding. Rosen could see the figures of American infantry in foxholes along the roadside, dirty and smoke-stained, some waving, some just staring in tired disbelief as the armored column rolled past. They had expected tanks. They had not really believed they would arrive. Payne's platoon formed a line along the southern edge of the village, hulls angled to cover approaches, turrets poking between houses. They set up as best they could in hull-down positions, using low stone walls and the crest of the ridge to hide their weaker lower armor. Payne moved from tank to tank on foot, talking with his commanders, putting them into firing arcs that overlapped. Behind them, in the burning village, infantrymen redistributed ammunition and tried to strengthen their foxholes between bombardments. "Rosen," Payne said, leaning into the turret. "You see that bend in the road down there, where it disappears behind the barn?" Rosen squinted through the gun sight. "Yes, sir. If tanks come, that is where we will first see them. You wait until they come into full view. No hero shots at muzzle flashes. We need first-round hits. We will not get many second chances." "Yes, sir," Rosen said. He tried not to think about panthers or tigers. In training they had been told about those, about their thick front armor and powerful 75 and 88 mm guns. The 75 mm Sherman could penetrate a Panzer IV frontally at reasonable ranges, but against a Panther's glacis or a Tiger's turret, it was a different story. The answer, the instructors had said, was to use cover, to close the range, to hit the thinner side armor. That made sense on a model board. On a frozen road in Luxembourg, with actual German tanks potentially coming up the hill, it felt more like a hopeful theory than a tactic. They did not sleep that night. German artillery continued to probe, though the heaviest fire fell elsewhere as the offensive rolled westward. In the early morning hours, German infantry tried to infiltrate into Hosingen, only to be driven back by a combination of small arms, mortar fire, and the tank's coaxial machine guns. Muzzle flashes lit the snow with brief, savage flares. The air smelled of cordite and burning wood. By dawn, the village was a mix of smoldering ruins and hastily dug foxholes. Elsewhere along Skyline Drive, other elements of the 707th were fighting their own battles. Tanks from Company B were stretched thin supporting infantry strongpoints farther north, exchanging fire with German patrols at roadblocks that seemed insignificant on a map but were crucial choke points in reality. Company C's tanks, fighting near Dijkerche and Edelbruck, had their hands full dealing with units from 352nd Volksgrenadier Division pushing across the river. All of them, knowingly or not, were buying time. On the German side, the offensive had begun with optimism. Officers in the 2nd Panzer Division and 26th Volksgrenadier Division had been told they would punch through exhausted American units and drive quickly for the Meuse. The Ardennes was rough ground, but German staff officers had calculated that with surprise, concentrated artillery, and armored spearheads, they could force their way along the limited road network. By the afternoon of December 16, some of that optimism had already begun to erode. Resistance was stiffer than expected in many places. Small American outposts refused to surrender, forcing the Germans to deploy troops and spend artillery shells on positions that were supposed to crumble at the first blow. The narrow roads became clogged with vehicles, horses, and marching infantry. Behind these traffic jams, valuable hours ticked away. In the headquarters of 2nd Panzer Division, Oberst Meinrad von Lochert studied reports from forward units and frowned. Clervaux, a small town but an important road junction on the way to Bastogne, had not yet fallen. The Americans, he was told, had tanks and anti-tank guns there, as well as stubborn infantry. Hosingen, Marnach, and several other villages along Skyline Drive were still in American hands well into the second day of the offensive. This was not how the schedule was supposed to look. On the morning of December 17, German assault guns and Panzer Grenadiers attacked Clervaux from the south. 6 Sturmgeschütz 3 and 30 armored half-tracks moved up the road, expecting to brush aside whatever was left of the American defense. Instead, they found themselves under fire from Shermans of the 707th Tank Battalion, positioned to dominate the narrow road into town. In a short, violent engagement, 5 Shermans managed to knock out 2 of the Stooges, their burning hulks blocking the road and forcing following vehicles to halt. The Germans pulled back to regroup, and for a time the road remained impassable, clogged with wrecks and the bodies of vehicles and men. It was a small tactical success, quickly overshadowed by events elsewhere, but for von Lochert it was another delay, another indication that this offensive would not be an easy drive. When the Germans returned later that day, shifting their attack to the northern approaches of Clervaux, they brought more armor and infantry. American tanks from another battalion, the 2nd Tank Battalion of the 9th Armored Division, fought desperately but were overwhelmed by well-handled Panzer IVs. 14 Shermans were knocked out, many of their crews killed or captured. The town itself became a death trap of collapsing buildings and burning vehicles. The regimental headquarters of the 110th Infantry made its last stand in the Clervaux Hotel and the medieval castle above the town, before being finally overrun. In these fights, Ripple's battalion was being used up piece by piece. From his position near Hosingen, Payne monitored what he could of the wider situation through intermittent radio updates. The picture that emerged was grim. Strongpoints were surrounded. Some had been ordered to hold at all costs, their commanders knowing full well that meant being overrun eventually. Relief attacks had faltered. The enemy was not a small raiding force. This was something larger, coordinated, and deadly serious. By the second day, ammunition was running low. Supplies that would have been difficult to move at the best of times now had to fight their way along roads under German observation and sporadic fire. Fuel was still adequate for the tanks in the line, but the battalion could not afford to waste it. Every move had to be carefully calculated. There would be no grand sweeping maneuver, just a series of stubborn stands at roadblocks and villages, shifting tanks as needed to plug holes. In between the major engagements were the small decisions that never make it into high-level histories but determine who lives and who dies. A company commander deciding whether to leave one tank behind as a rear guard while the rest pull back to a new position. A maintenance sergeant deciding that a damaged tank can be towed to safety if they can just get a cable on it before the next artillery salvo lands. A platoon leader deciding whether to risk a short counterattack down a side road to knock out a German gun that has been harassing a road junction. In one such moment, Payne faced a choice that would haunt him. A German anti-tank gun, somewhere in a copse of trees 1,000 yards away, had been lobbing shells down the road intermittently all morning, forcing resupply trucks to scatter and hug ditches. It was not a heavy gun, not dangerous to the Shermans at that range, but it could tear apart a soft-skinned truck or a jeep. The infantry company commander begged for it to be silenced. Payne studied the ground through his binoculars. The road curved and dropped before the trees, then rose slightly. There was a low ridge off to the left that might give a hull-down position if a tank could reach it. But between his current position and that ridge was open ground, under potential observation and fire from other German positions he could not yet see. "Sir," his tank sergeant said quietly. "We could put one tank out there, maybe two. We might get lucky. Or we might feed them to that gun and whatever else is with it." Payne nodded slowly. The thought of that gun still firing, still sending shells down the road at his supply trucks and at the infantry hunkering in their foxholes, gnawed at him. But he had 4 operational tanks left. Each was precious. Each represented 5 men he knew by name. He made the choice. They would not charge the gun. Instead, they called down artillery on the approximate position and waited, listening to the distant crump of shells in the woods. When the shelling stopped, the gunfire did not resume. Whether it had been destroyed or simply relocated, they never knew. For every such decision, there were others with no good options at all. Herrera, meanwhile, waged his own war against breakdown and damage. He crawled under tanks in roadside ditches to weld patches over penetrations that had not quite killed the vehicle. He supervised the installation of spare track blocks as improvised extra armor on vulnerable spots. He cursed the cold and the mud, but he refused to order his men into hopeless recovery attempts. There were tanks they could save and tanks that had to be abandoned. Sometimes, they had time to set charges and blow a disabled Sherman so the Germans could not use it. Sometimes, they did not. A tank that had been theirs one day could be patched up and turned against them the next. On the night of December 18th, the battalion began a fighting withdrawal toward Wiltz, a larger town west of Skyline Drive that had become a focal point for retreating elements of the 28th Division and stragglers from other units. The order from higher headquarters was clear enough. Bastogne, to the northwest, had been identified as a key road hub and was being reinforced by airborne troops and elements of the 10th Armored Division. To buy time for that defense, units like the 110th Infantry and the 707th Tank Battalion were to hold forward as long as possible, then fall back slowly, making the Germans pay for each mile. By then, the battalion was a shadow of its original strength. Company D, the Light Tank Company, had been virtually destroyed in its early attempts to stem the tide near Heinerscheid and elsewhere. Company A and B had lost numerous Shermans in the swirling fights around Marnach, Hosingen, and Clervaux. Some crews were dead, others captured. Replacement crews, hastily cobbled from maintenance personnel and headquarters clerks, tried to fill the gaps. The tanks that remained were scraped, blackened, and patched, their whitewash streaked with soot. Wiltz itself was a town of narrow streets and stone houses nestled in a bend of the Wiltz River. In peacetime it might have been picturesque. In December 1944 it was a crossroads and a target. As remnants of the 110th Regiment and other shattered units trickled into Wiltz, Cotta and his staff tried to improvise a new defensive line. Stragglers from Marnach, Hosingen, and the surrounding villages arrived in small groups, some still armed and organized, others disoriented, half-frozen, and shell-shocked. Straggler collection points were set up. Officers tried to sift the flow, sending men with weapons to join ad hoc battle groups while others were directed farther to the rear. Ripple brought what was left of his battalion into the chaos and reported to division. There was no way to recreate a coherent armored battalion at this point. Instead, his remaining tanks were parceled out again to support infantry roadblocks and defensive positions around the outskirts of Wiltz. The town lay astride one of the main routes the Germans could use to swing toward Bastogne. If it fell quickly, the road net to the west would open up. If it held, even for a day or two, the Germans would be forced to slow, to divert, to fight for each bridge and intersection. The crossroads where Payne had received his stark orders was one of several such points around Wiltz. There, in the fading light of an already short day, the battalion's story entered its final act. Snow had continued to fall, though not heavily enough to cover the churned mud and shell craters completely. The temperature hovered below freezing, cruel but manageable for men who had already known what wet, bone-deep cold felt like in the Hurtgen forest. The tanks were arranged along a shallow rise that commanded the approach road. Engineers had thrown up hasty obstacles, dragging logs and carts into place. Infantry had dug shallow foxholes where the frozen ground allowed it, and tried to extend their trenches with pickaxes and gloved hands. Ripple walked the line, checking in with each platoon, each tank commander. His own Sherman, nicknamed Blood and Guts, in a bit of dark humor, sat near the center of the position. It had already survived more than one brush with destruction. Its armor bore the marks of glancing hits and shrapnel. New scars would soon be added. He stopped again at Payne's tank. "You know your arcs," Ripple said. "Yes, sir," Payne replied. He was exhausted, his eyes hollow, but his voice was steady. "We have fields of fire down the road and across that field to the right. Sam has the ranges. Ammo is low, but we are prioritizing AP and he for tanks and infantry. White phosphorus if they bunch up. How is your crew holding up?" "They are tired, sir." Payne hesitated. "But they will do their jobs." Ripple nodded. "We all will." Radio intercepts and prisoner interrogations had made the picture clearer. The units pressing toward Wiltz included elements of 5th Volksgrenadier Division and 26th Volksgrenadier Division, with armor in support. They were not going to be content with probing attacks. They wanted the town, and they wanted the roads it controlled. As darkness settled, German artillery began to search for the American positions around the crossroads. Shells landed in the fields and along the road, flinging up plumes of earth and snow. The tanks buttoned up, hatches clanging shut. Inside the steel hulls, the noise of each explosion was magnified. The air grew stale quickly, breath condensing on cold metal surfaces. Rosen sat behind his gun in the dim red glow of the interior lights, hands resting on the traverse handles. The loader crouched next to the ammunition racks, ready to slam shells into the breach on command. The tank's commander stood in the turret, his eyes pressed to the periscope. It was like being inside the heart of some armored animal, muscles tensed, waiting for the moment to strike or run. The artillery shifted, some of it walking back toward the town itself, other rounds falling farther forward. Then, through the thuds and crashes, they heard a new sound, the steady, mechanical growl of multiple engines. "Tanks," someone said softly over the intercom. "They are bringing tanks." The first German vehicles appeared as shadows, darker smudges against the slightly lighter snow, moving cautiously along the road and through the fields. Through his gunsight, Rosen could make out the outlines better. Panzer IVs, by the look of them, boxy turrets and skirts along their sides. There might be other types behind them, but these were the ones on point. "Panzer IVs, range 800, he reported. "Coming up the road in column." "Hold fire," Payne said. "Wait until they are in the kill zone." The lead tank moved past the point Rosen had marked as the start line in his mind, creeping into the portion of the road that all the Shermans could see and cover. The German commander, staring out from his own cupola, might have seen nothing but shadows and burned-out farm carts ahead. On the way, Rosen whispered, and squeezed the trigger. The 75mm gun boomed. The tank rocked back slightly on its suspension. Through the gun sight he saw the AP round strike the Panzer's side plate, just behind the front road wheels. The German tank shuddered, a brief jet of flame spitting from an open hatch before smoke began to pour out. The column halted, confused. Other American guns opened up. The crossroads erupted in muzzle flashes. Tracer rounds stitched the night. German tankers scrambled to get off the road, to fan out into the fields, but the snow and the soft ground underneath made quick maneuver difficult. One Panzer slewed sideways, its tracks spinning uselessly as mud and snow churned beneath them. German guns answered. High-velocity shells screamed past the Sherman's positions, slamming into the embankment or the trees behind them. One found its mark, hitting a neighboring tank squarely. The hit blew a chunk of armor off the turret and sent the Sherman rocking. Its engine died. Inside, the crew struggled to open hatches, to escape the confined space before fire and smoke filled it. Two men spilled out onto the glassy plate, one dragging the other, both silhouetted against the burning tank for a second before they tumbled into the ditch. Infantry came forward behind the tanks, dark figures low to the ground. German machine guns rattled, their rounds snapping overhead or slapping into the dirt around foxholes. American infantry replied with rifles, bars, and their own machine guns. Mortar rounds fell between the lines, spraying shrapnel. It was the kind of chaotic, intimate violence that made officers lose control of the bigger picture. In the cramped interior of a tank, the battle shrank to the view through a sight and the voice in the headset. Rosen's world became one of target, fire, reload, adjust. A German tank angled toward them, its gun traversing slowly. He aimed at the joint between turret and hull, fired, saw the round glance off with a shower of sparks. The loader slammed another AP round into the breech, shouting something Rosen did not quite catch. The second shot hit lower, punching through the Panzer's side. The enemy tank lurched, then stopped. Another German shell detonated against the earth in front of them, showering the Sherman with dirt and fragments. The tank's front periscope starred with cracks, but held. Inside, the driver swore, then checked his controls again. "Still moving," he reported. "She is still with us." The fight for the crossroads lasted for hours, though time inside the tank felt disconnected from any normal measure. It came in bursts of activity, firing as fast as they could at shapes that moved and flashed, then in stretches of tense waiting while artillery searched for their positions again. Eventually, as ammunition dwindled and both sides accumulated casualties, the German effort slackened. Their tanks pulled back, some limping, some covered in infantry riding on their decks. The battered American tanks held their ground, engines idling, barrels blackened. When the order finally came down to pull back toward Wiltz proper, it was not because the line had broken at the crossroads. It was because the enemy was bypassing them elsewhere, threatening to encircle the town. Holding the position any longer would mean being cut off completely. Rippel faced another cruel choice. In the night between December 20th and 21st, as German units closed in around Wiltz, he gave an order that no tank battalion commander ever wants to give. His surviving tanks, many already damaged, low on fuel and almost out of ammunition, were to be destroyed in place. The crews would then attempt to escape on foot or in whatever vehicles were available, heading west toward Bastogne or farther along the American lines. The Shermans that could still move were driven into out-of-the-way spots, engines run until fuel was exhausted, then charges were set inside them. Maintenance men who had nursed these machines through months of combat wired detonators with the same care they had once used to repair engines. When the charges went off, in a series of dull booms and flares, the tank's armor split and warped. Turrets were blown askew. Guns sagged like broken bones. "Feels like shooting your own horse," Herrera muttered as he watched one of the explosions from a ditch. Old girl deserved better. Rosen stood beside Payne, looking at the wreck of their tank. They had fought in it in the Hurtgen, on the roads of Luxembourg, at Hosingen and here at the crossroads. The vehicle had been a kind of home, a cramped metal room that had kept them alive in places where soft flesh was not meant to survive. "Think the Krauts will be disappointed when they find this?" the loader asked, trying for a joke. Rosen managed a thin smile. "They will curse. That will have to be enough for me." Rippel gathered his officers in the shattered town, gave them their instructions. Small groups would move west separately, avoiding roads when possible, linking up with friendly units if they could find them. There would be no organized breakout, no battalion formation. At this point, survival would depend on stealth, luck, and the willingness of men who had spent their war inside tanks to trust their boots to carry them. In the days that followed, survivors of the 707th trickled into Bastogne and other American positions, adding their stories to the growing legend of the Battle of the Bulge. Some were folded into ad hoc infantry units. Others were reassigned to new tanks when replacements finally arrived weeks later. Rippel himself reached Bastogne after a hard journey and continued to serve with armored formations as the American counteroffensive rolled east again. What had their sacrifice bought? The German offensive in the Ardennes gained ground, but nowhere near as fast as its planners had hoped. Instead of swift armored columns racing through a broken front, the panzers found themselves embroiled in bitter fights for villages like Hosingen, Marnach, Clervaux, Wiltz, and countless smaller roadblocks. Each cluster of American defenders, often outnumbered and undergunned, forced the attackers to deploy, to detour, to burn fuel and time. For the units facing the 28th Division sector, this was particularly true. The 110th Infantry Regiment and its supporting units, including the 707th Tank Battalion, were virtually destroyed as organized fighting forces. Thousands of men were killed, wounded, or captured. Yet their stubborn defense delayed the 5th Panzer Army significantly. Hours and days that had been meant for rapid westward advance were spent reducing pockets of resistance. The timetable for reaching the Meuse slipped. By the time armored spearheads from divisions like 2nd Panzer and Panzer Lehr approached places like Bastogne and the approaches to the Meuse, the Allied High Command had recovered from the initial shock. Airborne divisions had been rushed to key road junctions. Patton's Third Army had pivoted north in a remarkable maneuver, driving relief forces toward Bastogne. The winter skies cleared enough for Allied aircraft to take to the air, hammering German columns and supply lines. The Germans still achieved a salient that bulged westward, giving the battle its later name. But they did not break through to Antwerp. They did not split the Allied armies. Instead, their offensive ground to a halt and then was pushed back, leaving the Wehrmacht in the west weakened by the loss of tanks, fuel, and irreplaceable men. It is always difficult to draw straight lines between one small unit's actions and the fate of campaigns and nations. War is too complex, too full of contingencies and overlapping causes. Yet it is clear that without the delaying battles fought in the early days of the Ardennes offensive, the German timetable might have looked very different. The stand of the 110th Infantry and the armored roadblock set up by the 707th Tank Battalion and other units forced the enemy to pay for every crossroads they took. For the men who were there, the view was not from map tables or intelligence summaries, but from the sights of their rifles and guns, from foxholes and tank turrets, from the cold, cramped space under a Sherman where a mechanic tried to patch a hole before the next barrage. They did not know they were buying time for Patton to pivot or for paratroopers to dig in at Bastogne. They only knew that someone had ordered them to hold, and that behind them were their comrades, their friends, their own rear areas. Behind them were roads filled with trucks, medical units, supply depots, and, somewhere beyond all that, a world that might someday be at peace again. Long after the fighting moved on, some of the places where they fought kept tangible reminders of those days. In towns like Clervaux and Wiltz, Shermans left behind or dragged back from the fields were restored and set up on stone plinths as memorials. One such tank, known by its nickname, Blood and Guts, still stands in Wiltz, its olive drab paint clean now, its scars preserved as part of the story. Children climb on it in the summer. Veterans have stood before it in the winter, remembering the feel of cold steel under their hands and the sound of the engine coughing to life on a freezing morning. If you walk today to a crossroads along the old Skyline Drive, where a narrow road curves along a ridge and drops toward a village that has rebuilt itself brick by brick, it is hard to imagine the roar and chaos of those December days. The trees have grown back. The shell holes have been smoothed over by time and weather. Only small markers, plaques, and the quiet presence of old tanks by churchyards hint at what happened there. Yet history, in its larger arcs, still bears the imprint of those small, desperate stands. The Battle of the Bulge is remembered as a vast, swirling campaign, with famous names like Bastogne and Saint-Vith, with maps showing arrows advancing and retreating. Inside that bigger picture, though, were countless smaller stories, moments when one platoon, one company, or one battalion was told simply to hold the line or die. For one Sherman battalion sent to what was supposed to be a quiet front, that order came at a frozen crossroads in the Ardennes. They obeyed it as best they could, through fear and exhaustion, through confusion and loss. They fought from village streets and ridge roads, from hull-down positions where their thinner armor and smaller guns could be turned into strengths by terrain and courage. They saw their machines destroyed and their unit broken apart, but they kept delaying, kept resisting, until there was simply nothing left to do but blow their own tanks and walk west. The hours they bought cannot be measured on a clock now. They exist in the space between German expectations and German achievements, in the difference between a plan that called for the Meuse by a certain date and a reality that fell short. They exist in the breathing space that allowed other men, in other units, to organize defenses and counterattacks. History will always remember the Battle of the Bulge as a whole, the last great German offensive in the West, the snow and the fog, the surprise and the eventual Allied victory. But within that name are smaller circles of memory, like ripples spreading from a single stone dropped into a river. In one of those circles stand the tankers of the 707th and their comrades, men who once sat inside steel hulls at a cold crossroads and were told there was nothing behind them if they failed. They did not fail quickly. That is why there was something left behind them when the smoke cleared.